Montana Territory, September 1883. The blood on her wedding dress had dried stiff by the time Odessa Porter slipped through the back pasture fence. Boots soaked, lungs burning, heart thundering like hooves over hard ground. She did not look back. Behind her, the lights of the ranch house flickered like dying fireflies in the dusk, swallowed by the tall pines and rising mist. She had run from a marriage that would have killed her literally. And now, with nothing but a satchel and a bruised rib from where James Cawley had thrown her against the cellar door, she was heading north through wilderness she had only ever seen on maps. She had one plan: reach the Bitterroot Mountains, disappear. But she had not counted on the wolf pack trailing her, and she had not counted on the cowboy. Silas Rawley had not meant to ride this far north. He had been driving cattle down from the high pastures when he heard the scream sharp, high, and human cutting through the trees like a whip crack. He kicked his gelding hard. By the time he reached the clearing, the wolves had already circled, low and lean with hunger. And there in the middle, back pressed to a boulder, stood a woman in a torn white dress, brandishing a broken tree limb like it could save her. "Hey!" Silas shouted, gun drawn, and fired once into the sky. The wolves scattered. She collapsed. He laid her in the back of his wagon, wrapped in a horse blanket. She did not stir until well past midnight, when the fire he built crackled steady and the stars hung low over the pines. Her eyes opened slow, pale green like spring grass after snowmelt. "Where am I?" she rasped. "Safe," Silas said, voice low. "You are safe." She blinked at him. "You are bleeding." Silas touched his temple. One of the wolves had gotten close enough to graze him. "It is nothing." She sat up too fast, winced. "Ribs cracked, I think." He poured water from his canteen and handed it over. "What were you doing out here alone?" She hesitated, then, "Running." He waited. He did not ask again. After a long silence, she said, "My name is Odessa Porter. I was supposed to marry James Cawley this morning. He killed the preacher." Silas did not move. "Say again." He was drunk. "Hit the man with a lantern. It shattered. There was screaming. I just ran." Silas stared at the fire. He had heard of James Cawley, rancher, mean, rich, dangerous. "You ran in your wedding dress." "I had no time to change." Silas looked at her, really looked. Mud smeared the hem. The lace was torn at the shoulder. Her hands were scraped and shaking. "You did the right thing," he said. Odessa nodded once, then curled into herself like someone used to being small. "Are you going to take me back?" "No," Silas said. "I am going to ride you out of here." She looked up. "I know a trapper's cabin near the river, abandoned now. You can rest there." "Then we will figure something out," she whispered. "Why would you help me?" Silas kept his eyes on the fire. "Because no woman should have to run for her life in a wedding dress." He rode all night. Odessa leaned into him on the saddle, half asleep, arms around his waist. She never complained, even when the trail turned steep and narrow. Silas felt every shiver through her body. At one point, when the wind picked up, she tucked her face against his back and whispered, "Thank you." It hit him hard. He had never been thanked like that before. They made the cabin by dawn. It was nothing more than a one-room structure with a crooked roof and a wood stove, but it stood solid and dry. Odessa stepped inside and dropped to her knees, fingers pressed to the warped floorboards like she was praying. Silas started a fire. He found her a wool shirt and trousers from the trunk in the corner. She changed behind the stove, quiet and quick. When she stepped out, sleeves rolled and hair braided down her back, she looked like someone reborn. "I will stay out front," Silas told her. "You sleep." Odessa hesitated. Then she walked over, touched his hand with hers. "Do not leave." He looked at her. "I will be right on the porch." "No," she said softly. "Please, just stay close." So he sat on the floor, leaned against the doorframe, and she curled up on the cot with her back to him. She fell asleep in minutes. And for the first time in a long time, Silas Rawley felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with regret or distance. He felt peace. When Odessa woke, it was late afternoon. The light through the window was gold. She sat up slowly, muscles stiff, ribs sore but bearable. Silas was still there. He had fallen asleep too, hat tipped over his face, legs stretched out. She watched him a moment. The way his chest rose steady. The way his hand twitched near his gun even in sleep. He had saved her life. She did not know who he was, not really. But something about the way he had held her on that horse, the silence between them, the way he had not once asked for anything in return, it made her feel safe in a way she had never known. She rose, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The sun was sinking low. A deer grazed across the clearing. Birds chattered in the trees. Silas stirred when she sat beside him. "You slept," he said. "So did you." He smiled, slow. "Good." They sat there a long time, the quiet between them easy now. Odessa said, "I do not know what happens next." Silas looked at her. "We figure it out together." She turned to him. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." He said it simply. Like it was true, Odessa swallowed hard. Her throat ached, but not from fear now. From something else. Something warm. She looked at his hand resting on his thigh, rough and steady, and she reached for it. Their fingers laced slow, and Silas Rawley did not let go. The rain set in 2 days later, slow at first, just a hush in the pines, but by dusk it had thickened into a steady rhythm that made the roof groan and the eaves weep. The logs of the cabin swelled with damp, and smoke from the stove coiled low and stubborn. Silas had patched the worst of the gaps with moss and canvas, but the cabin still breathed with the wind. Odessa stood by the window with her arms folded, watching water pool in the hollow near the old trapline. Her hair was still damp from the creek where she'd washed it that morning, and she wore the overshirt Silas had given her, sleeves pushed past her elbows. She hadn't spoken much that day, but her silence was different now, quiet like a page turned, not like something clenched shut. Silas stirred venison stew in the pot, wrist loose, mind focused. He didn't glance up when he said, "Storm'll last through tomorrow. I can help with the wood once it lets up. You'll do no such thing with that rib. It's mending. You still move like it ain't." She turned from the window. "You always this stubborn?" He met her eyes then. "Only when I'm right." She didn't smile. But her gaze held. She sat on the edge of the cot, careful not to jostle the stack of folded linens she'd sorted that morning. "You said you were driving cattle when you found me. That your land?" "No. Belongs to a man near Deer Lodge. I ride for him come late spring. Rest of the year I trap and break horses." "You live alone?" "Have for 6 years." She nodded slowly. "You ever wish you didn't?" Silas wiped his hands on a rag, folded it, and set it beside the pot. "Some nights. Not others." Odessa reached for the tin cup beside her, took a sip of the cooled tea she'd steeped earlier. "What happened 6 years ago?" He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked. Wind brushed the shutters. "Little brother drowned in the Jefferson," he finally said. "I was supposed to be watching him." Odessa's fingers tightened around the cup. "I'm sorry. I was 18, thought I knew better than the river. I didn't." She set the cup down. "You don't push people away. But you don't let them too close either." "Not till lately." They looked at each other then, not long, but long enough. She broke it first, stood, walked to the stove, and ladled stew into 2 bowls. Her hands were steady now, a little thin still, but sure. She handed one to him and sat near the fire. "I used to read by a stove like this," she said. "Back in Kansas, before my mother got sick. What you read? Whatever I could get. Almanacs, penny novels, scripture. I liked the ones with women who made it out." He chewed slowly. "Didn't think those stories ended well. Most didn't, but some did. I used to think it was the endings that mattered most. But now I think it's the part after the part they never write down, the quiet after the storm. The stew was hot and rich with time. She finished every bite. Silas reached for the kettle, poured more water into her cup. What would you do if you could choose? She traced her thumb along the rim. Mend things, so I'm good with cloth. I like making something whole. He nodded once, thoughtful. There's a town west of here, Darby. Small but decent folk. Blacksmith needs a hand, so does the dressmaker. And the collies, they'll think you went south. I left a false trail that way. You're sure? He looked at her steady. I don't do things halfway. She set her bowl aside, leaned back against the wall. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the hollow beneath her chin. If I went to Darby, would you come too? His jaw shifted, not from hesitation but consideration. I would. She nodded once, like something inside her eased into place. Then I will. The rain deepened outside, drumming the roof like hoofbeats across earth. Odessa reached for the needlework she'd started with the scrap fabric he'd found in the trunk. Her stitches were small, even. She didn't ask what came after Darby, not yet. But Silas watched her hands move, thread pulling through cloth, and thought. She makes things whole. And for the first time since the river took his brother, he let himself wonder what it might mean to stay. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world rinsed clean and quiet. Mist clung low to the tree trunks, and the ground steamed where the sun touched it. Birds returned to the branches, their calls soft and thin, like they too were recovering from the weight of the rain. Silas saddled his horse while Odessa packed the satchel they'd found in the cabin's loft, one with sturdy buckles and a worn leather strap. She folded the needlework she'd stitched into the bottom, not to hide it but to keep it close. He watched her from the corner of his eye. The way she checked the stitching along the bag's edge, gave a small nod, and slung it over her shoulder. There was purpose in her movements now. She didn't ask if he was ready. She simply stepped out onto the clearing and waited. They rode westward along the ridge trail, the horse moving sure-footed despite the mud. Odessa sat behind him, one arm around his waist, the other gripping the saddle horn. Her cheek rested against his back, not because she was tired, but because she trusted him to lead. They didn't speak until they reached the edge of a burned field where lightning had once struck dry brush. Charred stumps jutted from the ground like blackened teeth. The smell had long faded, but the silence there held a different weight. That storm must have gutted this place, she said. 2 summers ago. Fire jumped the creek, nothing they could do. She studied the husks of trees. I used to think ruin meant the end of something. And now I think it just means something else has to begin. Silas turned his head slightly, just enough to feel her breath warm against his collar. You always talk like that. I stopped for a while. Her fingers tightened at his side. When your days belong to someone cruel, you learn to make your thoughts small. He didn't speak into that. He only reached down and adjusted the reins, keeping the horse steady as a gust moved through the clearing. By mid-afternoon, they reached a stream cut with cold runoff. Odessa slipped from the saddle and knelt to wash her hands. Her reflection wavered in the water, hair darker from the rain, jaw sharper than it had been. She didn't flinch when she saw herself. I could work in a place like Darby, she said after a long moment. I could take measurements, mend seams. I know how to turn a dress inside out and make it fit better than it ever did new. You'd be good at it. I'd like to make coin that's mine, even if it's not much. Silas crouched beside her, rinsing the dust from his palms. You'll have it, and no one'll take it from you. She glanced at him. What about you? I'll help the blacksmith a while. I'm no stranger to shoeing iron. You'd stay. He didn't look away from the water. I would. They camped that night just beyond a bluff where the land dipped into meadow. The grass grew high and sweet-smelling, and Odessa gathered dry twigs while Silas cleared a patch for the fire. She didn't ask how he learned to move through the woods without sound, how he knew which branches would burn clean. She only watched, noting the way his hands moved like he'd done this 100 times. After supper, she sat cross-legged near the flames, brushing the tangles from her hair using fingers and a bit of leftover lye soap. Her scalp stung, but she welcomed it. She hadn't had the space to tend herself in years. Silas leaned back on his elbows, watching the sky fade from indigo to black. "You ever see the ocean?" "No, you, once. Oregon coast. Wind like a fist to the chest." She smiled faintly. "I'd like to see it, just once. To know what it feels like to stand at the edge of something that doesn't end." He looked at her, then not just her profile in the firelight, but all of her. The woman who'd outrun a man with blood on his hands, who'd left behind everything familiar because survival demanded it, who now sat across from him wearing borrowed clothes and speaking of oceans. "If we get to spring," he said, voice low, "I'll take you." She didn't answer right away. Then she leaned forward and wrapped both hands around her knees. "I believe you." It wasn't said like a wish. It was said like a fact. The fire hissed as a log shifted. Somewhere close, a coyote howled once, then went quiet. They lay down beneath the stars, not touching but close enough to hear each other breathe. Odessa didn't fall asleep quickly, but she didn't toss either. Her body stayed still under the blanket, like she'd found a place she didn't need to run from. Silas kept his eyes on the sky long after her breathing slowed, counting the stars until his own thoughts dulled. He didn't know what waited in Darby, but he knew what he'd found in the woods. A woman who could outlast a storm and still speak of beginnings, and he wasn't about to let her go. By the time the church bell in Darby came into view, whitewashed and leaning slightly eastward, the sun had begun to slip behind the hills. Odessa sat straighter in the saddle, her legs aching but her gaze steady. She hadn't asked how far it would be or how long they'd stay. She only asked, once they crossed the shallow ford outside town, "Do they know you here?" Silas nodded. "A few do. I'm not the kind they worry about." They passed a freight wagon stuck in the mud. A boy waved from the back, his cheeks smudged with soot. Odessa nodded to him, hand resting lightly on the saddle horn. She hadn't spoken much since morning, her thoughts turned inward. But the closer they drew to the cluster of buildings, and the smell of coals, smoke, and bread, the more her shoulders eased. Silas stopped at the livery first. A man with a crooked arm and an iron grip greeted him with a quiet, "You're late," before motioning toward a stall with dry hay. "I brought someone with me," Silas said. The man glanced at Odessa, then back at Silas. "Don't matter to me. You paying for two?" "I am." They didn't linger. Silas led her down the boardwalk, past shuttered shops and the sound of a fiddle leaking from behind the saloon's swinging doors. Odessa stayed close, not out of fear, but because she didn't know these streets yet, their creaks, their silences. A woman with a wash basket nodded politely. Odessa answered with a quiet "ma'am." They reached a narrow building with curtains drawn tight and a dressmaker's sign faded from sun. Silas knocked once before stepping inside. A woman with gray threaded through her dark braid looked up from a hemline. "Rawley," she said, setting her needle down. "You finally bringing me a customer. This is Odessa Porter. She can sew." Odessa stepped forward. "I don't need coin today. Just a chance to show what I can do." The dressmaker studied her a moment. "Ever worked with calico that's been worn thin at the knees?" "I've patched worse." The woman stood. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll set you up with something from my pile. If it holds, you stay." Odessa nodded once. "Thank you." Back outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of horses and smoke. Odessa didn't speak until they reached the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and a narrow path led toward a stand of old cottonwoods. "Where will we sleep?" "There's a shed behind the blacksmith's," Silas said. "He lets me use it when I pass through. It's dry and there's room enough for two." She followed him without hesitation. The shed was plain, with rough planked walls and a cot pushed against one side. A wood stove sat cold in the corner, its pipe rusted but intact. Silas lit a lantern and set it on the crate between two stools. Odessa sat slowly, hands folded in her lap. "That woman in the shop, she looked at me like she was trying to figure something. She sees plenty. But she judges little. She'll ask questions. She might." Odessa leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "I don't plan to lie, but I won't tell everything either." "You don't owe them your story." She looked up. "Do I owe you?" "No," Silas said. "But I'll listen if you ever want to tell it." She didn't answer, but her eyes settled on his, and something passed between them, quiet, steady, unmistakable. Then she looked toward the cot. "I'll take the floor." "You won't." She raised a brow. "I've slept on worse," he said. "You need the rest." She hesitated, then nodded. He laid his bedroll near the stove and stretched out fully clothed, hands behind his head. Odessa removed her boots, folded her skirt beneath her for warmth, and lay back on the cot. "You always this decent?" she asked in the dark. "Only when I mean it." The wind rattled the shed door. Crickets sang low in the weeds outside. Odessa closed her eyes, the ache in her ribs finally dulling under the quiet. "Silas?" "Yeah. If I stayed, if I worked and saved and built something here, would you stay with me?" His voice came without pause. "I would." She exhaled, slow and deep, like the answer had settled something she hadn't known was still unsettled. Neither of them spoke again. But as the lantern burned low and the sound of the town faded, they both knew the shape of what they were building: a life not hurried, not taken, not forced. A life chosen, piece by piece, like stitches in good cloth. The summer lights softened as the days lengthened, and Odessa rose each morning with the creak of the floorboards under her boots and the scent of starch and camphor clinging to the dressmaker's shop. She worked at the back table, where the sun filtered through the warped window panes, her fingers moving with quiet precision across worn seams and fraying cuffs. By the third week, Mrs. Larrabee no longer hovered behind her shoulder, and Odessa was trusted with custom work: a wedding bodice, a soldier's jacket returned from war, a widow's mourning veil. In the evenings, she and Silas walked the edge of town, where the fence posts leaned and the tall grass bent with the wind. They didn't speak much during those walks, but Odessa began to notice the way he paused before the same cottonwood each time, hand brushing its bark, as if grounding himself. She didn't ask why. She only began to do the same. One evening, she stepped out of the shop with her sewing basket tucked beneath her arm and found Silas waiting by the hitching post, a folded paper in his hand. "Telegram came," he said. "It's from my mother's cousin in Miles City. She heard about Cowboy." Odessa stood still. "How?" "Someone found the burned ledger from the preacher's house. His name was in it. Folks are asking questions." She set the basket down. "He'll come looking. He's not in the territory anymore. Word is he sold off half his cattle and rode south after the marshal started sniffing around." Odessa looked past him toward the hills. "Then it's over." Silas didn't speak. He reached for her hand instead, and she let him take it. His skin was rough, his grip gentle. "I've been thinking," he said. "There's a parcel of land out past the river, belonged to an old Swede who passed last winter, no kin. The deed sitting in the clerk's drawer, near forgotten." Odessa looked at him. "You want to buy it, with you?" She let the words settle. "I'd want a sewing room and chickens. We'd have both. I don't want a house too big, just one with light and a back door that doesn't stick. I'll build it myself." She smiled, slow and sure. "Then I'll stay." They married in the church with the leaning bell, under a sky so blue it seemed to hold its breath. Odessa wore a dress she made herself simple, lavender-hued with hand-stitched flowers at the hem. Silas wore his best coat, sleeves a little short at the wrists, and boots scrubbed clean for the first time in years. Mrs. Larrabee stood behind Odessa, teary and proud, while the blacksmith handed Silas the ring he'd forged from a broken bridle bit. When the preacher asked if they would love and keep, Odessa looked into Silas's eyes and said yes like it was a promise already lived. They moved onto the land that autumn. Silas built the house with his own hands, oak beams, river stone hearth, cedar shingles that sometimes howled with wind but held fast through snow. Odessa planted hollyhocks against the southern wall and hung lace curtains she'd hemmed by lamplight. She kept a ledger for her sewing commissions, and by winter's end, her name was known across the valley for her skill with a needle and her quiet grace. They slept each night with the wood stove humming and the wind against the eaves, their fingers laced beneath the quilt she pieced together from remnants of forgotten cloth. One evening, after the first frost painted the field silver, Odessa sat beside the fire with a bolt of navy wool across her lap. Silas was sharpening a drawknife nearby, the rhythmic scrape steady and familiar. "I never told you," she said, "but the night you found me I thought I was going to die." Silas looked up. "I know. But when you said I was safe, I believed you. I still do." He stood and crossed to her, crouching so their faces were level. "You are. As long as I have breath, you are." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "I don't carry that fear anymore, not because of the land, not because of the town, because of you." He kissed her, then slow, certain, without pause. It wasn't the first time, but it carried something deeper than before. A knowing. A home built not of walls but of trust earned and kept. Years passed. The fields turned gold each fall, and the creek behind the house never ran dry. Odessa's sewing brought women from as far as Hamilton, and Silas broke horses in the wide meadow where blue lupine grew. They planted apple trees and watched them blossom. They read by firelight, shared bread with neighbors, and sat quiet on porches through every kind of weather. They never spoke of Cawley again. There was no need. What mattered was the life they built, stitch by stitch, plank by plank, word by word. A life not borrowed, not owed, but chosen. Together. And they loved each other wholly every day after.